So I'm so thrilled for the opportunity to talk to you, especially since there's people in this room that I've talked to talked about these various issues with at different points in my career, and so I'm really excited about this chance. It's such an important series that the library does, and I really want to thank the people that were part of doing all the work to organize this, so thank you. So what I thought I would do today is start generally and talk about some of the issues and the questions, the kind of process that motivated the book in the first place. And sort of set up some of the sum of the overarching argument. And then to make it less abstract or less general, I'm going to spend most of the time, about 2/3 of the time, telling the story of one part of the book, which is the origins of the Rockefeller drug laws. And these are sort of the infamous laws that were passed in 1973, spearheaded by Governor Nelson Rockefeller at the time. And they do certain work in my book, which I'll be talking about, but they're actually critical just on their own terms, because the laws were widely hailed as the opening salvo in the modern war on drugs, sort of the model of the modern war on drugs. For the modern war on drugs, they were replicated in varying degrees. These sort of harsh sentencing drug laws were replicated in varying degrees, and that in turn became an important driving force of mass incarceration. Now, I'm not saying that the drug war is the only story you need to know to understand what happened in mass incarceration. That's actually not true, but this is sort of one important thread. So, Getting Tough, this book started, interestingly, as part, I had spent 6 or 7 years after graduate school doing anti-poverty advocacy and working with welfare rights organizations. And this book, in a way that I hope will become clear, in some ways really came out of that experience. But it also started as an effort to understand the origins of mass incarceration. And this is a graph, I'm sure everyone has seen some version of this graph at various points, but I want to understand how the United States got from basically how this happened, how we have just decades of what's essentially sort of steady rates of incarceration to today, when we have a penal system without historical and certainly without any national precedent. So clearly people generally agree that the sort of turning point that happened in the 1970s and that the escalation started generally in the 1970s. So I wanted to understand how this happened, but I also, again, because of my sort of experience working around issues in the welfare state, I was really determined to try to understand the relationship between the changes in the welfare state since the 1970s and the changes in the penal system. And I was struck by what I interpreted as a paradox, right? Which is people more and more interpreted, when they're characterized as sort of politics of the late 20th century, they talked about it as a period of state retrenchment, of state retreat. So both critics and supporters of the increasingly conservative Republican Party talked about their period in governance as sort of connected to a project of small government. Okay, and what I was curious about is like how you can understand, how we can persist in understanding the era's politics in an era when state governments, local governments, and federal governments are involved in building the most massive penal infrastructure that, in U.S. history. So I wanted to poke at this and particularly understand what's the relationship between the see, there I go, I'm just stating at my microphone. What's the relationship between a retrenching welfare state and a growing penal system? And in my field of history, first of all, this was recent history. So in my field, there had, in all fairness, not been a ton of work, because this is, for many historians, this just is quite recent. The scholarship's not very robust. But historians have largely studied these institutions separately. Obviously, there are people that studied the penal system, there are people that studied developments in the welfare state. There was research outside of history that had put these institutions together, and a lot of that's in sociology. And just to be quick, I'm going to crudely characterize with some very complicated and really wonderful work. But this work tended to see an inverse and a sequential relationship between the welfare state and penal developments, meaning that they tended to see that the welfare state was displaced by a growing carceral state or a penal system, meaning that political elites stopped managing social and political inequality with social welfare responses and instead enlisted policing and prisons. So this is, again, I'm sort of crudely characterizing some arguments. And I actually think this actually captures a lot of what happened. Certainly better than thinking about the late 20th century as a period of like a withdrawing or an absent state. But the work often, because it didn't set out to do careful histories. It operated at a fairly high level of abstraction. And I hope that a historian could contribute by actually going in and tracing what's on the ground, what's the historical relationship between these trends. There's no fiscal mechanism that takes $1 away from food stamp allotment and give it to the prison system. There's no, so that's a sort of historical and political process, and I was interested in poking at that. So I was like, how does this happen? What's the relationship really on the ground between these things? So I went into the archives, as one does, if this is one's job, and to look, and started looking closely at debates in crime and drug and welfare policy in the 70s. Again, this wasn't a really like scandalous or controversial time period to focus at, because historians were really starting to decide that the 70s is this sort of, is this pivot point necessarily between what's considered this sort of high point of liberalism in the 60s and early 70s, and then Reaganism, or however you want to characterize what's happening by the 1980s. And so we can talk more about why I settled on the particular sort of studies or stories that I did, but I ended up focusing on 3 high-profile state-level policy fights. One was over welfare, and it's really ended up being the origin stories of the notion of the welfare queen, which I'm happy to talk more about if people are interested. I actually gave a talk about this a couple weeks ago here. And so it's the history of anti-welfare politics. And by welfare, I mean AFDC, the program of cash support for low-income parents. And so that's one of the studies. The second is the Rockefeller drug laws, which is the one that I will talk about today. And then the third one was was about criminal sentencing, and it was about the end of what's called indeterminate sentencing in California, which is the place where people consider as this quote, the fall of the rehabilitative ideal, which is the repudiation of the idea that prisons are intended to rehabilitate and to reintegrate quote unquote offenders back into society. So with welfare, what I ended up telling is a story about how welfare programs ended up incorporating both penal rituals, but also increasing coordination with the penal system during this period. With the determinate sentencing case, it ended up being a story about the penal system really evacuating itself of its welfarist mission, of the idea that it would serve like a kind of social, to be kind of a little bit inaccurate, sort of its social work aspect, its role of reintegrating people who had been incarcerated back into society. And then the one that I'm going to talk about today is actually, in many ways, a story of a certain core issue, drugs, or particularly low-income drug users who sell drugs, of a problem of incredible social concern being handed from the welfare state to the penal system. Like an actual, as opposed to changes within the system, an actual transfer of responsibility. It's a little bit more complicated than that when I actually got in and researched it, but for the purposes of this, that's the easy way to sort of cast out those 3 different things, those 3 different stories that I told. So, as I researched, I actually started becoming a little uncomfortable with this narrative of a welfare state to a carceral state. And I mention this only because it's also become a trope in some of the critiques and the criticisms that circulate more broadly in society about how we explain sort of what happened, or how do we narrate this. And particularly because I think it paints just an overly rosy vision of an earlier period. If you read the prison rights organizing, if you read what the people in the prisoners' movements of the 60s were saying, they were already saying they lived in a carceral state in the 1960s. Similarly, there wasn't much, for many, many Americans, particularly African Americans, it wasn't as if there was this robust welfare state that folks had access to before the 1960s. Nor, for many of us, probably many of us in the room, is the welfare state gone now. So I started sort of rethinking this frame, and as opposed to understanding the histories of these two things as separate or as sequential, I began to conceive of them as deeply intertwined, and often trading logics and informing each other. I began interested in the ways that the penal system and welfare systems have long coexisted, and sometimes actually symbiotically coexisted. So these systems clearly have shifted in scale. I'm not suggesting anything to the contrary. But I became more and more interested in the ways that they have been consistently deployed together to secure social order, particularly in some of the most marginalized communities. So, what I ended up arguing in the book is that the institutional transformations of the late 20th century, these transformations, the increasing penal system and the sort of retrenchment within the welfare system, were symptoms of its struggles to explain and respond to what become understood as an urban crisis. So this is a cluster of governing problems that arose from the economic dislocations and political insurgency of the 60s and 70s. And I'm not going to go into here exactly to build out the sort of nature of what created these governing problems, but I'm going to point out that there was already political work being done to group a whole host of sort of diverse issues under the rubric of an urban crisis, right? What calling something an urban crisis did is it groups sort of crime and political unrest and political organizing and sort of social problems and stark housing inequalities, all these things under the same umbrella, which did some really important and sometimes problematic political work. So what my book really focuses on, and what I want to sort of focus on today, is the debates over how to respond to this particular cluster of issues, right? So the clashing interpretations of drug use, concentrated poverty, racial inequality, political insurgency, crime. And what I argue is that in each of these political fights, and these are three political fights, I'm not saying this happens every political fight that happened in the era, in the three that I chose, I found a similar pattern. The fight was not over if the state had a role in managing social inequality or handling social problems. It was over what strategies work for which populations and which problems. And so basically, sometimes it was as simple as who do you need to hire to handle this particular problem or this particular population. And sometimes it was actually cast that starkly. Like, do you need to hire Head Start parents or do you need to hire policemen? Like, what is the nature of the problem? And so in each of these stories, politicians repudiated and I'm saying ostensible because it was always conflicted, an ostensible commitment to, quote, inclusion, to social reintegration and rehabilitation, and these strategies that were repudiated in these struggles were really under assault from both the right and the left. And it's important to understand how that these strategies had been really under siege and to a large degree discredited from that sort of Pincher-like action. But in these stories, what replaced it was that they embraced getting tough. This notion of, it's a masculinist understanding of how you manage particular problems. And so when I'm saying tough strategies, I want to go back to my picture of people being tough. This is the cover of my book. Can people tell who this is? Rockefeller and Reagan. What's hilarious is, and I'm not going to really have time to get into it, but they look really like they're having a lot of fun together right here, but they did not, they were obviously quite at odds. Yeah, and they are dressed up as cowboys. I mean, to be fair, they were at like a hayride for the Republican National Convention. So what I mean by tough strategies is I came to think of these as actually strategies of civic degradation. So they were varied, but they were punishment, surveillance, social segregation, retracting rights and benefits. So what I'm saying is that in a period when African Americans became much higher percentages of the population regulated by the penal and welfare system outside of the South, both of the institutions that I'm talking about backed off of their always conflicted and limited stated objective of reintegrating and transforming subordinated people into, quote, full citizens. And sometimes, and often actually explicitly repudiated that project. So the last thing I want to say before I actually get into the much more fun part, which is the story of Nelson Rockefeller, is that I'm particularly concerned in this work about the productive power of policy itself, and particularly the force of criminalization, and that we need to take seriously the role that these things, the role that actual public policy and political discourse has in organizing common sense. So I argue that punitive crime and welfare policy did not merely reflect a backlash to civil rights, for instance, or a conservative, sometimes people talk about a drift in the electorate. I don't know how an electorate just sort of drifts right, but I mean, sometimes you hear this language, but actually helped organize it. And that the political spectacle of getting tough on people, both sort of by enacting legislation, but also by on the street arresting, for instance, welfare recipients. The political spectacle of doing those things actually, in particular in getting tough on these various racialized targets, helped transform what were actually highly contested claims about, quote, the failure of liberalism into common sense, and forward arguments that certain marginalized populations were unsuitable for full citizenship, were and ungovernable without coercion and containment. That you simply could not govern certain populations without coercion and containment. So basically what I'm suggesting is that policy and politics was instrumental in creating the underclass, right? In building the idea that an underclass exists, this group of people so foreign and different from society they could never be reintegrated, that political creation, which for people, which hangs over, which looms over the 1980s and politics in the 1980s, 90s, I mean, it's the notion of the super predator, I mean, kind of continues to go on, that policy and politics helped create that. It didn't discover, it doesn't discover that. Okay, that's the kind of general framing, and I want to continue by telling the stories of the Rockefeller drug law. And should we just have him loom over our heads here? That's him. His glasses are amazing. I totally want those as sunglasses. We might want to put him away at some point. So the way I'm gonna sort of organize this is that I'm gonna sort of talk about the Rockefeller drug laws as an attempt to make sense of and offer a political resolution to a series of political problems, social problems, and economic dynamics. So, and that many of so there was a set of problems and these laws helped resolve them. But I'm stressing that they're political problems and they were a political solution. I'm not arguing that. I want to sort of divorce ourselves from discussions about drug policy that think about drug policy in terms of its programmatic effects. There's this incessant, totally understandable, there's a whole industry of people producing reports to show that the war on drugs didn't work. And what I'm trying to say is that we should talk about the ways in which it did work, kind of putting aside the question, basically saying, yes, they didn't work programmatically. And what I'm going to say about the Rockefeller drug laws is I'm not sure anyone really thought they would, but that they did very important political work. And the political work that I'm going to suggest that they do is that they end up recasting a host of social problems and political problems as the problem of the racialized, irredeemable drug pusher. So basically re-narrates the problem of sort of social disorder, crime, and drugs itself as the problem of the drug pusher. So I'm going to go over the problems that Rockefeller faced. Prior to the law's passage, I'm going to talk about how these laws provided an unstable, highly contested political solution to these disparate problems. And I'm particularly interested in the way that these laws helped position punishment as common sense, as the common sense sort of inevitable solution to these sets of problems. But I want to underscore, for us, that's sort of been largely that's been naturalized in the decades since, but at this moment, it was really anything but a total common sense. We are talking about a moment when medicalized conceptions of addiction were ascendant. The Republican mayor of New York City, this is John Lindsay, because it's a different Republican Party, but the Republican mayor of John Lindsay was publicly floating the idea of heroin maintenance clinics in New York City at this period, of actually just just sort of prescribing heroin. And this is a man with national political ambitions at this period. Obviously, they had started methadone clinics. I mean, there was already drug maintenance happening to various degrees. So people at the time were predicting, I mean, of course, they couldn't see that uptick in the graph that I showed you. People at the time were talking about the prison as withering away, as leaving the, I mean, not everybody, by the way, but I mean, there were certainly people, but there were people talking about the prison as becoming an increasingly sort of irrelevant and bulky technology of social control, and that there would, now I am in no way suggesting that the sort of impulse to punish was not there. That is absolutely not true. But particularly in policy circles, really harsh sentencing, particularly around drugs, was a largely discredited idea at this moment. So the problems. The first, I guess, the place to start talking about the Rockefeller drug laws and problems would be the problem of drugs. So the rates of illicit drug use, especially heroin, did increase when the supply, so during World War II, the heroin supply chains had actually really been stamped down, but they reopened after World War II. In those next decades, the number of heroin addicts, I'm putting addicts in quotes, we can talk about it, so the category itself is a very political and fluid one during this period, and always. So the number of heroin addicts grew tenfold during the 1960s. And since the drug trade almost all flew through New York City during this period, people estimated that half of the nation's addicts lived in New York City. They also claimed that, and to some degree, I think this is true, that it was concentrated amongst African Americans and Latinos. This was because of a number of factors, but I think what's critical to recognize is that policing, the actual patterns of policing, had really been instrumental in corralling drug markets into communities of color. And obviously the police, in ways I'm not going to get into, but are important, were really implicated in the drug trade itself. So there's huge debates about the right. I didn't even say any statistics, but I want to say I recognize that there's huge debates about the reliability of statistics about drug use and also crime. But for our purposes, and they were inflated, there's no question that they were inflated to some degree during this period, but for our purposes, what matters most is that people thought drug use was climbing. And the dynamic was largely noted in communities of color, but really didn't get broader attention until there became also a really big uptick in crime rates in New York City. And so politicians had long faced considerable pressure from within communities of color to grapple with the issues of drugs. But I want to be emphatic, there's no one black community that spoke with one voice about how this issue should be handled, and there were a lot of different people advocating for much different responses. But as the reports of the crime rates rising got more and more attention, drugs and crime fused as a racialized political problem, predominantly because people, and the way that this was done in the actual political narrative was, the assumption was that the reason that we were seeing crime rates go up was because drug users were having to commit crimes to get their fix. All of this happens in the context of a profound shift in thinking about addiction in itself. And I gestured to this earlier, and I don't want to go into it a lot, but this idea that compulsive substance abuse was a medical disease. It's not like it's brand new in the 60s, but it really had become much more ascendant. So by 1962, the Supreme Court actually rules you can't put someone in jail for being an addict. They say you can no longer put someone in jail to be an addict than you can for having a common cold. So it's really being codified at the highest level. Now, of course, but you can put them in jail for having like a syringe, but you can't put them in jail for having track marks, is the way the law ended up finally, just because the status of being an addict, but the act of fulfilling your addiction, somehow remains criminalized. So, but there was a ton of negotiations happening within the law over sort of how you define that law, that line. And New York State, really, also, but in a lot of ways New York City, and California were the two countries that led the nation in actually trying to work out what it would look like to respond as a society to drugs with an understanding of drug use as a medical problem. So they devoted unprecedented amounts of institutional monetary resources to a series of rehabilitative programs. So New York City funds a range of therapeutic communities, which are actually, they're so interesting, and I have to contain myself because I want to go on about them, but I have to move through. But in some ways, they're the progenitors of today's treatment programs that you would be able to access with private insurance. Some of the program, Daytop, some of the big programs actually come from this. But at the time, they were actually often led by groups of former or ex-addicts. But they were small residential treatment programs. What the state did the other thing the state did was they basically instituted a program of civil commitment for drug users, which means that I or anyone could actually call and say, I know a guy, he's a heroin addict, he refuses to get treatment, and then the state the state was empowered to civilly commit that person to treatment. And so it's essentially forced institutionalization. The state also started funding, this is sort of in semi-chronological order, a huge network of methadone maintenance clinics. These are actually very different strategies, but I don't have time to pull them apart. But the proponents of these programs especially rationalizing the state funding for them, they all rationalized that they would do two things, and herein lies the problem, one of the problems politically, that they would, quote, control crime. So all of these programs were rationalized on the basis of a promise to control crime. And the second thing was a promise to sort of some accountability to drug users, right? We're going to rehabilitate and cure drug users. And I'm going to suggest that this tension caused problems from the beginning. Now, I'm not going to talk about the relative effectiveness of these different programs is a whole different conversation. But what's important is from the onset, people were claiming that these programs had failed to deliver on these promises. And I think I'm going to kind of go through these quickly, but this is for a lot of reasons that actually have not a ton to do, where you don't even actually, some of these reasons you don't really actually, it doesn't have to have anything to do with drug users themselves. It turns out that building a massive, substantial network of treatment infrastructure is expensive, it's controversial, it's politically challenging. And one of the things that really surprised me is that it turns out that one of the biggest issues was that it was really impossible to open these programs because every community, people opposed having them in their communities. So there was actually a sort of really, there was a funding challenge of not wanting to pay for these things, but there was also a really hard time just opening them, just finding places to put them. Methadone maintenance, which was actually the program that had the best sort of statistical results. There were people who even saw some declines in crime. Methadone maintenance was particularly unpopular because people would have to travel through the community on a daily basis to go to the methadone clinic and pick up your daily dose. And there's a lot of people who would suggest if they hadn't designed the procedure in such a sort of controlling way that maybe it wouldn't have had so many problems when you unfolded it, but that's another conversation. The drug users themselves often did not want to go into treatment, particularly people that were civilly committed. Many drug users jumped at the chance when treatment was finally available, because remember, this really was before there was a massive treatment infrastructure. But many of these civic institutions, the institutionalization program, they were actually cited in old prisons, okay? So when people said treatment feels like punishment, it was quite a literal, they were actually in prisons, and because remember, they couldn't find places to cite these. And then remember, it's not like there's 10,000 trained social workers or ex-addict counselors that are circulating that are trained. So they were hiring often ex-prison guards to work in these institutions. So they weren't fun places. People that lived there rioted, rebelled, escaped, set fires, and when word got out, which it did very quickly amongst the networks, about how bad these places were, many people just refused to go into treatment at all, and in fact, they would often go to jail rather than go into drug treatment. Because, I mean, actually the treatment was often longer than the time they had to spend in jail for various crimes. So, and then obviously the bigger thing is that they didn't, they had promised, in the institutional promise for these programs, for these welfare state solutions to this problem, they kept on promising we're going to sweep the streets of addicts. And then they would set up 4 places with 5,000, I mean, I don't have the exact, I'm not saying these right numbers, but, and so they never had the capacity or the sort of state muscle to, even if it was a good strategy to institutionalize all drug users, which I'm not suggesting, the state never had the capacity or never experimented with this program, any of these programs, long enough to sort of even attempt to institutionalize this tactic. Now, to make matters worse, in the mid-'60s, there start to be complaints about reports of a surge of white heroin use. And there's a Richard Pryor, this is from the 80s, but Richard Pryor, the comedian, has a line in one of his stand-up routines where he says, they call it an epidemic now. He's like, that means white people are using it, which I think is like absolutely what happened in this moment. So people totally acknowledge that the increasing white heroin use was a complete game changer. So one official acknowledged before Congress, I can't imagine this didn't cause a problem for him later, but he said, as long as heroin was a problem isolated to the ghetto, it was a problem we could live with. I mean, often it wasn't quite so explicit, but that was, I mean, it was certainly just sort of saturated the conversation about why the problem suddenly got so much more serious. So, and in advancing these programs, Rockefeller forwarded this causal story about crime where drugs were at the center. So in one of his campaigns, and I'm not being a sophisticated, fancy historian, by the way, like this is not subtext, this is explicit text, where he's, I wish I could claim some sort of fancy analysis, but no, he's basically saying, so one of his campaign ads has an arm. So it's got a dark arm in the campaign ad, and then there's a needle next to it, and it says, the stealing, the mugging, the killing, all for this. And it explained this Rockefeller strategy, which is, quote, get the addicts off the street, put the pushers behind bars, and the crime will stop. So there's this narrative where it's drugs are driving crime, and pushers are driving drugs. So in this narrative, drugs are not always, but frequently positioned as indigenous to inner cities. So they're imagined as a disease that has escaped, although no one says it explicitly, what's sort of considered as appropriate area, and is now moving into a new territory. So, I mean, again, I wish this was subtext, it's not. Rockefeller explains, quote, that narcotics addicts are said to be responsible for 1/2 of the crimes committed in New York City alone, and their evil contagion is spreading to the suburbs. So Rockefeller increasingly holds pushers. I'm not saying he invents the term pushers as an idea that's been, has been around for a while. Thankfully, it's sort of fallen out of favor. But he holds pushers, and by pushers, they're typically assumed to be users or like low-income users who had to sell drugs to subsidize their habit. Holds pushers responsible for the creation of new addicts, and therefore, by the transitive property, addicts cause crime and urban disorder more generally. But what's important is that the pushers are literally the vector of disease through pushers. Now, what I'm not getting into, there was these incredible debates that were like, is he an addict pusher, or is he an addict? It's always very masculine. Or is he a pusher addict, or is he just a pusher? So there was a lot of really important work. People were really trying to sort of sauce out sort of which category of people was a candidate for punishment, and which candidate, and this isn't just the politicians, like in the local communities, people were like, that person's a problem because they're just making money off of this, right? They're just being a sort of leech on our community. They're not, like, this is not because of their own their own sort of addiction that they're doing this habit, for instance. So there was a lot of work of trying to parse out sort of who was what was the vector of disease, and who is appropriate for which sort of interventions. The next problem I'm going to not talk about for very long, but it's really fascinating, which is where the way Vietnam War comes home. There becomes an obsession in the early 70s about heroin use in Vietnam amongst the soldiers, and there was really a full-blown panic about the fact that they said like maybe 15% of the American soldiers were using heroin. It was cheap heroin, it was pure, it was very easily accessible. So not only people were saying we're not winning in Vietnam because they're all on heroin, was one narrative, but there was another. Another very serious concern was we're going to have all these weapons-trained addicts coming back into society, and this is a huge problem. What's interesting, I said I wasn't going to go into it, and here I'm going to it. But what's interesting is that the actual response by the state reveals how powerful it is to understand, to have different frames, and that there were really different frames to understand the problem. In a sense, the Nixon administration's response was, in effect, to actually decriminalize heroin use in the military. And what they did is they actually P-tested. They sent these huge, big, new, freshly minted P-testing machines to Vietnam, and they tested everybody before they left Vietnam. And if you tested negative, you had to stay and detox in Vietnam. And if you didn't, you went home. But it was, but they understood it. But it was a very situational understanding of drug use. People were like, it's there, it's cheap, and people are stressed. And they do, these are good American boys. I mean, like I actually quote, good American boys over there fighting. They're doing, like these are people. We got to understand what's going on. We got to just get them cleaned up and get them home. And like this is the way. There's also an epidemic there's a Valium Scare, which is also a drug scare that's happening in the early 70s. That's understood totally differently during this period. If people are interested, so I didn't really not talk about it, but okay. It turns out, by the way, that strategy was like largely successful. Maybe because there wasn't such a crisis in the first place. Maybe because people, if it means getting out of Vietnam, we'll do whatever it takes, and people will get off of, we'll stop using drugs. But I think it's probably a little bit of a combination of both. And many people did come home with drug problems. I don't want to minimize that. Another political implication, we're almost done with the problems. Another political problem that happened at this period, and it's really important and not talked about as much, is that the state's commitment to rehabilitate drug users, that local communities seized on that commitment and turned it into their own vision of what drug treatment looked like for them. So there was a lot of movements about people saying, okay, I want services in my community, but I want them to look a lot different. I want them to be culturally appropriate. I want them to be locally administered and locally controlled. I'd like some funding for those programs, but and so this isn't what necessarily and sometimes the visions of those programs were like explicitly revolutionary, right? So it was not what Rockefeller had in mind when like a group of organizers who were associated with the Young Lords like took over a wing of a hospital to set up a detox facility, at which point they organized everyone to become members of like some maybe revolutionary, I think, but it's a radical political project. That was not what Rockefeller had signed up for when he had said that the state needed to facilitate, rehabilitation. That wasn't the vision at all that he had in mind. So there was a problem that people were sort of really seizing on and negotiating what it meant, what rehabilitation services would mean, or what. And sometimes people said it's not rehabilitation, it's it's about redemption, but we're about redeeming society, not redeeming individuals. I mean, there was really a lot of work done to reformulate the way that these questions are being understood. The last political problem that I will say is probably what you all thought would be the first political problem of this man, which is that man, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, wanted to be president. Very, 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 very badly. And why that's a problem is that he is viewed as he literally is the quintessential moderate Republican. I mean, people call them Rockefeller Republicans. And he's a moderate Republican in a period when the party, when there's increasingly powerful conservative elements running the party. And this is what I was sort of gesturing to with that fight between Reagan and Rockefeller. People understood those two as figures representing a struggle within the Republican Party. So it was in this context that Rockefeller first publicly unveiled this plan, the Rockefeller drug laws. And it was truly shocking to the political establishment when he declares, and it was his State of the State speech. I didn't know such things existed. It's kind of charming. State of the State speech on January 3rd, 1973. And the reason it was shocking is he basically starts by declaring that his drug treatment programs that he had championed for over a decade were total failures. So he says, it is time for brutal honesty regarding narcotics addiction. In this state, we've allotted over $1 billion to every form of education against drugs, treatment of the addict through commitment, therapy, and rehabilitation. But let's be frank, let's tell it like it is. We have achieved very little permanent rehabilitation, and we have found no cure. So he proposes that the penalty for the sale of hard drugs, regardless of quantity, is a lifetime in prison without any option of plea bargaining, parole, or probation. That's the original proposal. Now, the New York Legislature does not enact that. They enact what's actually not, it was a mildly diluted version of this proposal a few months later, but the original call is for complete and total banishment to prison. Now, to go back to this theme of the way that these things are grounded in the welfare state and they influence the history of the welfare state, the proposal depended on assumptions that therapeutic programs had failed and that there was no other way. Again, I wish I was being subtle. He literally says, these are drastic measures, he would say in an interview, but I am thoroughly convinced, after trying everything else, that nothing else will do. So the proponents claimed that certain levels of crime and of drug use made this the inevitable response. And what I'm suggesting is, my argument is that we actually have to flip Rockefeller's causal narrative. And that instead of suggesting that the drug, that it was incorrigible prisoners and foolhardy state treatment efforts that made getting tough inevitable, I'm suggesting that Rockefeller laws were actually implicated in the process of producing the vision of failed, hopeless people and of incompetent and hopeless state in general, but particularly state programs. So in short, they helped transform what really were highly political claims into more settled fact. Now, what's remarkable about the claim that he's making here is it's incredible what it erases, right? This is Rockefeller, it elides the fact, sort of most shocking to me, that it was really general consensus only a decade earlier that the experiment in mandatory minimum sentencing had totally failed. And this isn't like, I'm not talking, no one's reading reports which existed from like the Prohibition. This isn't like, this is in Rockefeller's political life that people really talked about these things as not, as ineffective, as sort of decidedly ineffective. Interestingly, for our contemporary political, sort of fun fact in our contemporary political situation, it was in the 50s that they had actually instituted the possibility of executing drug sellers, someone who would, the reason I mention that is because our president has recommended that as a proposal. But in this proposal, the 1950s, you could only call for execution if they had sold to a minor. So people pointed to this elision in the debate. So one assemblyman, actually an assemblyman who's still, interestingly, amazingly, in the assembly now in New York, Gottfried, he says, the governor has stated that we have tried everything in the drug field and has all failed. Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. It would be much more accurate to say that in the drug field, we have tried almost nothing. So he's actually insisting that it's criminalization that's the tried and failed strategy. But yet this insistence, so it's not just creating knowledge, this politics is not just creating knowledge about the need for sort of penal expansion, but about the impossibility of alternative routes, right? So, and Rockefeller at time acknowledged that it wasn't simply the failure of like drug users, for instance, or of the treatment programs that had complicated his efforts. So at one press conference, he explains that he sort of acknowledges that the wide-scale civil commitment hadn't been possible, quote, simply because of the horrendous undertaking that would have been involved. And then he goes on to say, you know what, if the federal government had paid for it, or helped us pay, quote, this could have been a very interesting, different, and additional phase, but this was beyond our capacity as a state alone. He also pointed to how political resistance had hampered the ability to build out the treatment program. He says, every community has, the tremendous bitterness in one community after another in opening treatment centers any place in this state. Every community had rallies and meetings to oppose it, to fight it, to stop it. He goes on, this has been our reaction as a society. He's sort of scolding them. This has been our reaction as a society. We don't want this problem, but don't bring these people anywhere near us for treatment. And so, but what's interesting is despite this sort of criticism, his strategy essentially offers what he imagines the people are asking for, which is a permanent and sort of very non-porous boundaries between, basically a quarantine strategy for drug pushers. What's interesting is there were a lot of people at the time who were like, one of the reasons that people don't want drug users anywhere near them is you keep on explaining them as zombies, the living dead, and people who, like the way that like the state's narration of the dangers that these people pose is part of the problems that we're developing. But I mean, I'm not suggesting that if the state had spoken differently that people would be enthusiastic about treatment programs, but that was part of the debate. So to wrap up, these tough drug laws didn't work programmatically. If people are interested, I can talk about the ways that they didn't, but I'm gonna I have to say, if you actually read the debates about how he basically proposes them, and part of what he says is like, I'm stopping listening to those people that study drugs. I mean, it's like really, I'm not trying to be mocking, that sounded really like cavalier, but what I'm trying to say is, in his narration of explaining these laws, part of it was a deliberate repudiation of liberal sort of social science expertise. There was no sense, he hadn't consulted with a bunch of drug policy experts that said that this would work. In fact, he proudly announced that the bounties for drug pushers was an idea that had been given by his stepson, who's in high school. But he's cultivating this, he's sort of saying that this is like, I'm kind of channeling this sort of popular knowledge. This is the way we feel this is the way that you should handle these problems. So they may not have worked programmatically, but they did political work, and they helped resolve political problems for Rockefeller individually, but also for more broadly. So all over the country, people explained that Rockefeller's continued viability as a Republican candidate rested on his success at passing the toughest, quote, toughest drug laws in the nation, and they would often reference Attica, the brutal retaking of after the Attica uprising. But they also did work more generally. So as new groups were using the state's therapeutic commitment to demand programs that were accountable to local populations, the Rockefeller drug laws repudiated any obligation to responding to the voices of low-level drug users. It basically said, this as a population, the state is severing responsibility to this group of people. And again, there was explicit places where Rockefeller says, I used to worry about the addict pusher. I can't anymore. This is not my problem. By taking resolute action against an issue that was unquestionably a concern within many African American and Latino communities, Rockefeller claimed to be accountable to communities of color. By targeting the pusher, who were charged as the source of widening drug use, these laws addressed anxiety about white heroin use while holding open the possibility of reintegration and rehabilitation for drug users from more affluent spaces who didn't get arrested selling and buying drugs, because many of the drug markets in more affluent spaces were not in open air and heavily policed areas. In this sense, I think it's interesting to note that these laws are part of the process of the bifurcation of drug policy that happens in the late 20th century, where middle class or white drug users are typically shunted towards a private treatment program, and poor and people in heavily policed neighborhoods are more likely to end up sort of shunted towards the criminal justice system. And I think it's important to note that the response to narratives of state impotence and the sort of impossibility of treatment to be effective was not retrenchment or the withdrawal of state responsibility, but the replacement of an emphasis on rehabilitation with strategies of punishment and incapacitation, or of quarantine. So the struggles over Rockefeller's punitive policy also did something, and this is something we see in our political discourse now, really served to constrict the range of debates about drugs between treatment and punishment. And by treatment, often coerced treatment. And I think you really see that in the debate around the opioid epidemic, that this is the sort of, are we a society that treats, or are we a society that punishes drug use? We're treating the opioid crisis, but we punish other drug crises. That's something that you hear. But I'm suggesting that in order to track this history, we have to stand outside of these binaries. We can't understand treatment and punishment as opposites. They actually share they share a focus on the individual, and then locating the solution of the problem in the individual, and they cut. When our debates focus in this way, we end up shoring out huge alternative visions and alternative strategies that were on the table then, and obviously now. So, but more than that, I want to bring attention to what I'm suggesting is that the political fight in this period wasn't, and nor is it now, about whether or not we treat or punish drug use, or whether we are a welfare state or a carceral state, but about who are the appropriate candidates for rehabilitation and reintegration, and who are the appropriate candidates for punishment and social segregation. So it's really about sorting, and not about sort of any totalizing, that there's a totalizing response. And so the drug laws were part of an ongoing negotiation over who the state was responsible to, not an abdication of state responsibility to manage social problems, and that these laws, and this is one of my critical takeaways with this, that they really were instrumental in re-narrating what were the limits of the welfare state and limits of political will as a problem of drug pushers. And by saying limits of political will, I mean reluctance to reintegrate poor drug users, to significantly fund a diverse range of treatment programs, to tackle the profound economic transportations in the way that they were exacerbating racial inequality. So all of these sort of challenges become re-narrated as a problem of the drug pusher. And what they did is that when they were passed, they became a really important illustration of the political utility of getting tough. And the way that worked, and that it did work. And I think that this political utility helps explain why, as opposed to avoiding New York's example after the incessant reports that these strategies there was unimpressive programmatic responses, it's this political utility that I think helps us understand why 48 states passed anti-drug laws with mandatory minimums over the next decade after these were passed. And why these strategies, even though sort of anyone who sort of studies this carefully, most people would agree these strategies failed programmatically, why they remain actually viable political postures even today in varying forms. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much.